So many of us feel a bit of dread when we get that jury duty notice in the mail, whether it's because it's tough on us when we're trying to work or, have to take care of our kids or for whatever reason. But still, most of us are ready to line up and serve. And that includes the former police chief of Bremerton and Kent, and who was eventually the King County Sheriff, now the director of the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, Steve Strachan. And Sheriff Strachan is kind enough to join us. You penned an article for the Kitsap Sun about this experience. And the thing I'm wondering is, what was it that surprised you after all the times you've had to go to court in uniform to testify?
Yeah. And I don't know that I would say it surprised me, but it was heartening. I've never been called to jury duty in my whole life. 38 years in law enforcement, when you total it all up. And I always assumed I must have been on some list, that I got excluded. I mean, not once did I get a jury notice. And when I finally did, I thought, well, that's okay. I'm certainly willing to serve. I thought it might be a civil case, and it could be possible they could keep me as a juror, but I certainly didn't think I would be kept on a criminal case. But when I got there and went through the process, and I sort of knew how it worked because I'd seen it from the other side. I'd seen it from the perspective as a uniformed law enforcement officer testifying on criminal cases, and I'd certainly testified many times in criminal cases, but always from that other side. And I would see that jury sitting over there, and to see what it looks like in terms of the selection process and what those citizens that had been called for jury duty went through was, I have to say, encouraging to me, not only to see how the process works, but the willingness of regular people in their regular lives to serve, even when it was at a really pretty significant inconvenience or hardship for them. And then secondly, to see in the conversations that they were having with the attorneys, as the attorneys were winnowing down that number to the final 12 jurors, as they had those conversations, how balanced and sophisticated and reasonable the conversations were. And it struck me how different real life was, how different it was to see real people living their lives and raising their kids and working their jobs, who were taking that time, and to see their perspective as opposed to what you see in 24-hour cable TV or social media, which can seem so sort of outrage based and all about people being going at each other. These were people that had a very sophisticated approach from all different perspectives, and I don't speak this way very often, but I thought about the founding fathers and the way they designed our Constitution and how brilliant that was to place that power to make judgments and find fact in cases in the court of law under the rule of law, in regular people, working people, people living their lives, who are brought together to be able to make determinations about their fellow residents and their fellow citizens. And even after all these years, even after all the different perspectives that I've been fortunate enough to have, it was frankly, it's pretty cool to see.
Now, you had mentioned, the founding fathers, of course. I believe the phrase is, a jury of their peers. But, you talked about some of the stories that people shared. Can you give us a couple of examples of, what people said, why it would be difficult for them?
Yeah. And that was another thing that really struck me was, I'd heard about people who had been called for jury duty that I knew, and they would say, oh, I've got jury duty. I wish I could find a way out of it, or this is going to be really inconvenient for me. And they sort of looked at it as a problem. And it was several dozen people that this started with. It's probably 50 people. And I live in Kitsap County. And so this was a Kitsap County Superior Court case. And, you had people from the shipyard that worked at the shipyard, people from the military, moms. We had bus drivers. We had a person who described themselves as a retail clerk. Just the absolute panorama of people. But again, all people who were there and willing to serve. And when the judge asked about hardships in order to excuse some people, I didn't see people saying, you've got to let me go. You know, there's no way I can be here. It's a huge inconvenience. They answered the questions, but it wasn't about, you know, I need to get out of here. It was, I want you to know what I'm facing. But it was very clear that they would all serve if they needed to, if they were asked to, that they would serve. But, you know, there was a person who said, hey, you know, they're an hourly worker. And if they don't work, they don't get paid. There is no comp time. There is no sick time. And that if they didn't work their hours, they would have a really hard time meeting their bills, paying their rent. You know, a mom who said, if this stretches into the next week, I would have trouble with daycare and being away from their kids. A person who had a spouse who was 8.5 months pregnant, a person who was leading a really significant military project at the shipyard, who said, you know, I'm the team leader. And he said, you know, they're going to, you know, this is a really important project for our military. And coming from all those different perspectives, but again, they all made it very clear that they would serve if needed. They would do their duty if needed. And it was encouraging and heartening to see that in person.
Now, you also mentioned the sophisticated nature of the conversation. What was it about that chat between all of them that made it so sophisticated?
Well, you know, I'll take a little bit of my own experience working as I do now with the Sheriffs and Chiefs Association, and a lot of the politics and the changes we've seen in terms of law enforcement, that was particularly the last few years, demands for reform, changing in some of the laws, concerns about public safety that people see. And I think we always seem to view it as a binary choice. You're either, you know, for public safety or you're for reform. And of course, it's not a binary choice. It's complex. It is something that we have to come together on. And again, as you see all these forces out there in our society, like social media, that want you to be in one corner or the other. But of this, you know, few dozen people that were being questioned, I guess, by the attorneys, you know, to decide who was going to be on the jury ultimately, they asked them because it was a case of an assault against a law enforcement officer. I mean, so the issue of a law enforcement officer's interaction with somebody and then being assaulted by that person was part of what they were going to talk about in the trial. So they asked a lot of questions about law enforcement, how people felt about law enforcement, the scrutiny that they were under as law enforcement officers, how they would feel about the credibility of law enforcement officers testifying. And I saw zero polarization. I saw nobody saying cops are always right. And I saw nobody saying cops are always wrong. They had a nuanced and balanced approach. And they said, you know, law enforcement's given amazing responsibility, which comes with an expectation of accountability. And it was just a very a good conversation among folks from all these different perspectives. And to see that and the interplay between the defense attorney, the prosecutor, and the potential jurors, and the defendant, by the way, who's sitting there through this entire process, was again heartening to see that you know, there are people at each edge that want to have, you know, their views, and they get a lot of attention. But the majority of folks out there, the people, frankly, in our real lives, they understand the complexities of the issues we're talking about. They acknowledge them, and it made me feel better about the people who have the task of deciding cases in court under the rule of law, people who vote, people who participate in society. And while we get a lot of attention on those edges, those people that make up most of us, they do understand the complexities of these issues that we're facing.
Now, you mentioned it makes you feel better about the people chosen. It sounds to me like it also sort of re-inspired your confidence in the system as a whole.
It did, you know, and the column went out, and I got a great note from an attorney from the area in which I live, and he, in fact, I printed it out here because I wanted to say what he said because I thought it was just so spot on. He said, after over 30 years as a lawyer, this person's a lawyer. He said, my view is the same as yours. The juries generally get it right, precisely because of that mix of humanity that you portrayed. He said, the rule of law requires lawmakers, law enforcers, lawyers, and judges, but it lives in the hearts of our juries. And I thought that's a perfect way to say that. And that's what I saw in the experience that I went through. I've also received word from a retired chief who said, I read your column, and he said he served jury duty as well in a different county. And he said his experience was the same. He was really impressed and encouraged by the reasonableness of the people that he had contact with from all across the community. And it does, I think, in the midst of what can seem like times that are pretty sometimes scary, and it seems like everything is extreme, to see real life was really helpful, to see how real people really feel. And it was encouraging to me.
Last thing I'll ask you then, any advice to anybody who feels that dread when they get the
Mhm.
jury summons but has never really been through the experience?
Um, well, having done that for the first time myself, I don't know that I had dread. I was just curious. And what I found was, I guess the advice I would give to people who feel that dread if they get their jury notice is, um, and I had heard about this, but I'd never experienced it. When the potential jurors entered the courtroom after the initial part of this process, the all the people in the courtroom, the defendant, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, they all stood up, as well as the judge. The judge stood up as a sign of respect to the primacy of the jury in the process of the rule of law and how important the jury was. My entire life as a police officer, whenever the judge came into the courtroom, everybody else stood up as a sign of respect to the judge. And to see a judge standing up for the potential jurors and to see that from that perspective shows you how important jurors are. It is conceptual in our system until you're really there and you see what it's like. And I guess I would ask people that feel that dread about getting a jury duty notice, look at this as an opportunity to see how our rule of law works in real life with real people. And I think, at least for me, it was a great learning experience.
Indeed. I've been through it once myself too. Didn't make it onto the panel, but I know exactly what you're talking about. Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs Director Steve Strachan. Sheriff, really appreciate you taking the time.
Anytime. Thanks for asking.